One of the most time-critical decisions a pilot will ever make is during the final stages of an approach, particularly when the decision to reject the landing is made from low altitude or on the runway. But what happens when the aircraft in that critical moment refuses to comply with the pilot's commands? The scenario becomes even more intense when the unexpected occurs. Modern aircraft are built with unparalleled safety standards, and the certification processes are so exhaustive that it seems almost impossible for a flaw to escape detection. However, even with all the rigorous certifications, there's always the chance that new requirements are introduced following an incident that reveals an unforeseen weakness in design or execution. But despite these meticulous certifications and regular updates, not every single scenario can be accounted for, particularly when standard operating procedures aren't fully adhered to. This brings us to an incident that exemplifies these realities. On April 8, 2022, a TAP Air Portugal crew prepared to operate a flight from Lisbon, Portugal, to Copenhagen, Denmark. While spring had begun to settle over Lisbon, Copenhagen's weather was far less predictable. A strong, gusty wind, showers, and temperatures barely above freezing. Such conditions are typical in Scandinavia during April, with winds forecasted to blow from 270 degrees at 20 knots, gusting up to 32 knots. This would create tricky landing conditions, especially given the orientation of Copenhagen's runways. The wind direction meant that all runways would be subject to strong, gusty crosswinds. The shortest runway, runway 30, was closest to the wind direction, but it also became the runway of choice for the flight, despite the fact that it was not ideal. The flight crew consisted of a 40-year-old captain with 10,000 flying hours, half of which were on the Airbus A320, the aircraft type they would operate that day. The first officer, aged 34, had accumulated 3,160 hours, with over 2,000 of those hours also spent on the Airbus A320. Given the anticipated weather conditions and the relatively short runway, it made sense for the captain to take the role of pilot flying, as captains often take control during more challenging conditions. This choice also speaks to the level of responsibility they carry for the safety of the aircraft and passengers. After reviewing their weather briefings and flight plans, the pilots briefed their cabin crew and proceeded to start their day. The aircraft for this flight was an Airbus A320-214, which was in excellent flying condition according to the technical log. This variant of the A320 family was powered by the CFM56 engines, which, as we'll see later, would play a significant role in the unfolding events. The first officer completed the walk-around inspection, while the captain set up the cockpit. The aircraft was ready for its flight to Copenhagen, with no apparent mechanical issues. After pushing back from the gate, receiving clearance, and taxiing out, the aircraft departed toward the northeast as planned. In the cockpit, the pilots had plenty of time to analyze the conditions they would encounter on landing. Given the forecasted rain and snow, the runway was likely to be wet, which would increase the required landing distance. Runway 30, at 2,365 meters in length, had only 2,095 meters available for landing due to a displaced threshold. While this was not an extremely short runway, it posed a challenge, especially considering the gusty winds and wet conditions. When landing on shorter runways, pilots typically prefer to use a higher flap setting to reduce approach speed and increase drag, allowing for a more controlled descent. However, with gusty crosswinds, using too much flap can reduce stability. Pilots flying aircraft like the Boeing 737 tend to use a moderate flap setting, flap 30, to maintain better control in such conditions. Interestingly, the Airbus A320 is noted to be more stable at full flap settings, with only marginally less margin to overspeed than at lower flap settings. This added complexity made the flap decision a bit tricky. In the flight manual, a recommendation was made for pilots to use less flap in such conditions, possibly influencing their choice. The pilots performed 3 different landing calculations, with varying flap settings and autobrake configurations. Ultimately, they opted for a flaps 3 configuration, with 20 degrees of flap and medium autobrake. This setup, despite not being one of the options calculated, provided a landing distance of 1,540 meters, well within the available runway length. Interestingly, this was not a configuration they had initially calculated, but given the weather conditions, increasing the autobrake setting without recalculating was a logical choice. A lower autobrake setting had given them a landing distance of 1,930 meters, which brought them dangerously close to the runway limit of 2,000 meters. As we now transition into the final stages of the flight, it's crucial to understand why the gusty crosswinds would present such a challenge for the crew. While crosswinds at higher altitudes don't pose a significant issue, at lower altitudes, especially during the final approach and landing, they demand precise control. The aircraft must be aligned into the wind, and the pilot's skill at managing the aircraft's angle of attack becomes the difference between a smooth landing and a problematic one. In the case of this flight, the winds were gusting, and the runway was short, all factors that would contribute to a more challenging landing. This is where the technicalities of the aircraft's performance, coupled with the decisions made by the crew, would play a critical role in determining the outcome of this flight. To add depth to our understanding, let's compare this scenario with another notable aviation accident involving a similar set of circumstances. On March 14, 1999, a Swissair MD-11 attempted to land at Zurich Airport under similar gusty crosswind conditions. The pilot had to abort the landing due to the wind's effect on the aircraft's stability, leading to a hard landing. While this was a different aircraft type, the challenges posed by gusty crosswinds and short runways remain similar across various aircraft. As we proceed with the narrative, we'll explore what happened next, diving deeper into the technical aspects of the Airbus A320, focusing on how the aircraft's engine configuration, coupled with the wind and runway conditions, led to unexpected behavior in the final moments of the approach. As we transition from the critical moments of flight into the final approach, it's essential to consider how aircraft respond to the forces of nature during landing. Aircraft, unlike boats navigating a river, must adapt to fixed, immovable runways oriented in specific directions. The challenge here is to align the aircraft with the runway, which can be likened to a boat trying to navigate a river, pointing its bow into the current in order to reach a specific mooring on the opposite bank. The aircraft follows a similar path when landing. As it nears the runway, the pilot maneuvers the aircraft to ensure it is aligned with the final approach track, typically by pointing the nose into the wind. This maneuver, known as establishing a crab angle, is highly effective during the descent, as it ensures the aircraft stays on course despite the crosswinds. However, the complexity arises when the aircraft is on final approach. Just as a boat needs to point its bow into the current to cross the river safely, the aircraft needs to decrab or align itself directly with the runway before landing. Attempting to land with a substantial crab angle could put undue strain on the landing gear, causing potential damage, while landing on dry runways with a crab angle could result in significant side forces. Landing on wet and slippery runways is slightly more forgiving. However, once the aircraft aligns, the crosswinds will inevitably push the aircraft toward the downwind side of the runway. The challenge becomes clear. The aircraft needs to decrab, and as it does, the pilot must simultaneously perform the flare, the maneuver to raise the aircraft's nose for touchdown. This requires exceptional skill, as these actions must be combined at the exact moment to ensure the aircraft stays aligned with the runway and touches down safely. This is especially true when dealing with gusty crosswinds, which add an additional layer of complexity. Pilots typically face a maximum crosswind limit for landing, which hovers around 30 to 35 knots under optimal conditions, and this limit is reduced if the runway becomes slippery due to rain or snow. For example, when dealing with gusty crosswinds and short runways, pilots are on high alert, fully focused on managing the aircraft's direction and maintaining control. While an experienced pilot may have the skills to land in crosswinds approaching the limit, less experienced pilots may be restricted to much lower crosswind limits, sometimes only 15 knots, depending on airline policies and regulations. These restrictions ensure that pilots can handle the conditions safely, even when wind gusts challenge their control. Given the short runway and the gusty winds, the task for the crew becomes even more critical. The final moments of landing require split-second decisions to ensure that the aircraft touches down as smoothly as possible. Every action, every decision, is influenced by the weather, the runway length, and the need to maintain control over the aircraft in challenging conditions. As we return to the unfolding situation with TAP Air Portugal's flight, these very challenges of crosswind landings and short runways come into play. The crew must handle not only the gusty winds, but also the limited landing distance. Given these conditions, the outcome of their approach becomes highly unpredictable. Before diving deeper into the specifics of the landing, let's reflect on how life itself sometimes throws obstacles at us in a similar way. Unexpected challenges that seem to push us to our limits. There are moments when no matter how hard we try, it feels like things aren't going our way. Many of us have experienced difficult periods, and for me, it happened when I moved to a new country, faced bureaucratic hurdles, and still had to keep up my professional responsibilities while being there for my family. In times like these, therapy can become a crucial support system, helping us navigate challenges and reach higher levels of personal and professional growth. That's why I'm grateful to have BetterHelp as the sponsor for this episode. BetterHelp offers online therapy, allowing you to connect with a licensed therapist from the comfort of your home. Through BetterHelp, you can access counseling that fits into your schedule, offering a flexible and supportive way to deal with stress and life's pressures. I've personally benefited from BetterHelp, and I'm confident that it can help others who are navigating tough times and striving to become their best selves. For those interested, you can visit BetterHelp.com /MentorPilot or use the code MentorPilot to receive a special discount on your first month of therapy. Now, let's get back to the story. As the pilots of TAP Air Portugal's flight approached Copenhagen, the weather report they received at 09:56 indicated that runway 30, their expected landing strip, was not in use as initially planned. Instead, the wind had shifted to 250 degrees, blowing at 24 knots with gusts up to 29 knots. This change in wind direction would give them an average crosswind component of approximately 20 knots, just under the maximum limit for landing under these challenging conditions. In conditions like this, as we've discussed, every decision becomes critical. The aircraft's response to the crosswind, the runway length, and the dynamic weather conditions would soon be tested in a way that no one could have predicted. As the flight of TAP Air Portugal made its descent into Copenhagen, the weather continued to play a pivotal role in the unfolding story. Storm clouds were reported in the vicinity of the airport, and a combined snow and rain shower had passed through just 10 minutes before the aircraft was expected to land. However, the visibility and cloud layers were within acceptable limits, and the conditions didn't pose any significant barriers to initiating the approach. The crew proceeded with the standard procedures for a safe landing. The captain briefed the first officer for a standard instrument landing system, ILS, approach to runway 30, and after completing the pre-approach checks, the crew requested an initial descent from air traffic control, following the usual procedures. At this point, everything seemed on track for a routine landing. But as promised earlier, we'll take a moment to dive into the technical details that play a crucial role in this flight. The CFM56 engines, fitted to this Airbus A320. While the CFM56 engines are primarily designed with two-shaft, high-bypass turbofans, similar in construction to those used on the Boeing 727, there are key differences that become critical in understanding this incident. The most notable difference lies in the reverse thrust systems. In the Boeing 727, reverse thrust is accomplished through hydraulically operated translating sleeves, which redirect the bypass air forward when activated. In contrast, the Airbus A320 utilizes 4 pivoting blocker doors to achieve the same effect. These doors are also hydraulically activated, but with separate activator arms for each door. Each of these doors is secured by both a mechanical tie and a primary door latch, which work together to keep them locked in place during flight. The activation and deactivation of these doors are controlled by the Engine Control Unit, ECU, which receives several inputs, including signals from the cockpit's thrust lever position, microswitches on the reverser doors, and, critically, the air-ground sensing signals from the weight-on-wheel switches in the main landing gear. These weight sensors are crucial, as they only activate reverse thrust when the aircraft is firmly on the ground, preventing any unintended activation during flight. This design was the result of changes made after the tragic accident involving Lufthansa Flight 004 in 1993. The incident highlighted the need to prevent reverse thrust deployment while in flight, which could lead to catastrophic failure. The upgraded system on the Airbus A320 was meant to ensure that reverse thrust could not be selected in flight unless the aircraft was on the ground, making it impossible to inadvertently activate reverse thrust during takeoff or in the air. Now, here's where things get interesting. Once the aircraft's reverse thrust is selected, the pilots are committed to landing. The decision to go around, a maneuver to abort the landing and climb away, is no longer an option. This is because transitioning from reverse thrust to forward thrust requires a significant amount of time and engine spooling, and there may not be enough thrust available to safely execute a go-around. Furthermore, if reverse thrust is engaged on one engine and the other engine is still in forward thrust, it could result in an extremely dangerous situation, as was tragically demonstrated in the crash of Pacific Airlines Flight 314 in 1978. This accident, which occurred at Cranbrook International Airport in Canada, resulted from the activation of reverse thrust on one engine while the other engine was still producing forward thrust, causing a loss of control. This led to changes in certification rules across the aviation industry, ensuring that aircraft could never be placed in this dangerous situation again. Since then, this rule has been enforced worldwide. Once reverse thrust is selected, a go-around is not an option. The certification changes introduced after the Cranbrook accident required aircraft to be able to transition from reverse thrust back to forward thrust safely and without risking catastrophic failure, even though such a situation should never occur. These changes were first implemented by Canada's aviation authorities, followed by the FAA in the United States. And while similar rules were not formally adopted by EASA in Europe, they became an industry standard. Aircraft manufacturers like Airbus still adhere to these standards when designing and certifying their aircraft. However, these compliance tests are only really put to the test once the aircraft has fully landed and reverse thrust has been selected, just like what was about to happen on this flight. As the flight continued, the crew received a gradual descent clearance and, by Tenet UTC, had been handed over to the Copenhagen approach controller. The crew was now vectoring for the ILS approach to runway 30. At this stage, they had completed all the necessary checklists, with the exception of the landing checklist. The captain requested that the flaps be extended as they prepared for the final approach. At exactly 10:01:55, the aircraft intercepted the ILS signal and began its descent toward the runway. Despite the turbulent weather conditions on approach, the visibility and wind conditions were within the capabilities of the pilots. They maintained their focus on the task at hand, with the knowledge that every decision, every input, would affect the final moments of this landing. And so, as the aircraft descended through the clouds and the runway began to materialize through the gusting winds, the pilots were preparing for the most critical phase of flight, the landing. As the final approach to Copenhagen's runway 30 progressed, the aircraft was now fully configured for landing. The landing gear was selected down, and the flaps were moved into the landing position, position 3. With the aircraft completely prepared, the pilots were handed over from the approach controller to to the tower controller. However, before that handover took place, the previous controller requested the crew attempt to vacate the runway via taxiway Delta, which would shorten the available rollout distance to just 1,530 meters. While this request wasn't ideal, the crew understood that it was simply a suggestion, and while pilots always strive to comply with such requests, they also know that if it's not possible to follow through, safety must come first. The pilots remarked that it was a bit much to ask for, but they would do their best to comply. At this point, the aircraft was descending through 1,420 feet, and the captain made a decision to disengage the autopilot and take manual control of the aircraft. While the autopilot can be used much lower than that, even down to the minimums, it's common for pilots to disengage it earlier in poor weather conditions to get a better feel for the aircraft and prepare for the manual landing. After all, flying manually can offer better control, especially in gusty conditions. At exactly 10:05 and 5 seconds, the tower cleared TAP Flight 174 for landing on runway 30. The aircraft was now ready for the final stages of the approach. The captain, fully aware of the tower's request and the gusty crosswinds, was likely laser-focused on getting the aircraft down on the runway, activating the brakes and reversers as soon as possible, especially with the wet runway in sight. The approach continued in a stabilized manner, with only minor deviations in speed. As the aircraft passed the threshold, the Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, began calling out, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, retard. At 30 feet, the captain initiated the flare to slow the aircraft's descent and began the critical task of aligning the aircraft with the runway, simultaneously decrabbing to counteract the crosswind. By this time, the captain's hands were resting on the reverse thrust levers, and as the wheels began spinning up before the shock absorbers could properly compress, the captain pulled the flaps up and engaged the thrust reversers. In theory, the reversers should only activate when the aircraft's weight-on-wheel switches are engaged, confirming that the aircraft is on the ground. These switches, as expected, activated, causing the reverse thrust doors to open and the spoilers to deploy, which brought the aircraft's weight down onto the shock absorbers. However, due to the strong crosswinds, the aircraft began drifting to the right, causing the left landing gear to briefly lift off the runway for a fraction of a second. This caused the captain significant concern, and rather than continuing the landing, he made the split-second decision to execute a go-around, what's also known as a bold landing. A bold landing, or go-around, is a maneuver requiring delicate and firm control. It's a maneuver that must be executed with precision to avoid over-rotating and causing a tail strike, or in this case, potentially damaging the aircraft's wings or nacelles. Since the aircraft was banked to the right during the go-around attempt, the captain had to ensure the correct speed and attitude to safely get airborne again. But something very strange happened during this crucial moment. The decision to initiate the go-around was made during a shallow bounce when the left gear had already briefly left the runway. This timing discrepancy caused a series of strange reactions in the aircraft's control systems. The commands from the Engine Control Unit, ECU, were now sent to the thrust reverser circuits. For the right engine, since the weight-on-wheel switches were still active, the ECU locked the command for reverse thrust and began spooling the engine up to increase forward thrust for the go-around. However, for the left engine, the command was not executed. The ECU did not lock the reverse thrust command for the left engine because its main gear was airborne for a critical 180 milliseconds when the command was given. This caused a dangerous situation. 3 out of the 4 reverse doors remained open, generating additional drag, as the aircraft was commanded to move into full forward thrust for the go-around. Despite the weight-on-wheel switches eventually activating again, this didn't change the aircraft's behavior. The first officer hadn't had time to call out the reversal of the thrust or the deployment of spoilers before the captain made the decision to go around. Here's the critical point. While the captain may not have been fully aware that he had activated reverse thrust before attempting the go-around, the consequences of this action were significant. Normally, once reverse thrust is selected, a go-around becomes impossible. This is because the reverse thrust needs to be deactivated, and the engines need to spool up to full takeoff thrust to climb away safely. But what happened here was like something out of a thriller. The right engine started to spool up, while the left engine was effectively locked in reverse due to the faulty wait-on-wheel signal. Thankfully, the system inhibited the left engine from transitioning into full forward thrust, preventing an even worse situation. This critical feature, which prevents the activation of forward thrust when reverse thrust is still deployed, likely saved the aircraft from an immediate catastrophic event. But while the left engine's system prevented further escalation, the situation remained precarious. The combination of reverse thrust on the right engine and the drag from the left engine's open reversers caused a serious imbalance in the aircraft's performance. This imbalance made the go-around attempt extremely difficult and left the aircraft in a highly unstable condition. In the split seconds following the captain's decision to go around, the aircraft's response to asymmetric thrust became immediately apparent. The right engine, roaring with full power, and the now idling left engine created a significant imbalance, sending the aircraft veering sharply to the left. The sheer force of asymmetric thrust caused the plane to lurch violently toward the left, with the left wingtip just feet away from scraping the runway. Caught off guard by the sudden and unpredictable motion, the captain struggled to regain control. His input came too slowly, and the aircraft began drifting dangerously towards the left edge of the runway. With the wingtips so close to the ground, it was a critical moment. The first officer, realizing that the go-around maneuver had been initiated, quickly adjusted the flap lever to position 2, the standard setting for a go-around. Despite the violent roll, the aircraft bounced once, and with a slight lift of the nose, it barely cleared the left edge of the runway, still struggling to climb. The captain, bewildered by how his previously stable aircraft was now almost unflyable, found himself in a desperate fight for control. To make matters worse, the slip and skid indicator, known as the beta target, failed. This critical display would have helped the captain determine whether the aircraft was turning with too little or too much rudder input, especially important when dealing with asymmetric thrust. In this case, the failure of the beta target was due to an internal setting in the aircraft's computer that inhibited its function once reverse thrust was selected. This meant that the captain had no visual aid to guide his control inputs, leaving him in a much more challenging situation as he continued the go-around. The aircraft, barely maintaining flight, was drifting outside the safety area next to the runway. It managed just enough altitude to avoid colliding with a glide slope antenna for the opposite runway. At this moment, the captain decided that the aircraft had enough positive climb rate to retract the landing gear, a decision that the first officer executed promptly. It wasn't until the aircraft cleared the runway's edge that the first officer noticed a warning for the left engine reverser unlocking on the aircraft's ECAM display. This was the moment when the mystery of the aircraft's erratic behavior started to unravel. The first officer called out the warning to the captain, finally providing an explanation for the aircraft's instability. With the reversers on the left engine still deployed, the captain now understood why the aircraft was struggling so much. He quickly inputted half deflection on the right rudder and raised the nose to 12.5 degrees, which is the standard climb attitude for a go-around. This finally allowed the aircraft to gain a positive climb rate of around 1,000 feet per minute, but it still hovered perilously close to the ground, just meters above nearby houses. As the aircraft reached 300 feet of radio altitude, the captain made a mayday call to the tower, requesting a climb straight ahead to 3,000 feet. In this moment, it's important to remember the golden rule of aviation: aviate, navigate, communicate. Even though the urge to communicate may be strong, the primary focus should always be on flying the aircraft safely. The mayday call was necessary, but at that point, The captain's primary task was to ensure the aircraft cleared the terrain and stabilized. The tower approved the request, and the aircraft continued its climb. Once the aircraft was safely out of immediate danger, the first officer initiated the necessary ECA, engine control actions, for the engine reverser warning, which included shutting down the left engine completely. The shutdown process was completed at about 1,200 feet, and almost immediately, the previously inhibited beta target indicator reappeared on the display, allowing the captain to regain full situational awareness. With the aircraft now stable, the captain re-engaged the autopilot and began the climb to 3,000 feet to prepare for the next steps. The immediate crisis was averted, but the crew was far from done. This incident revealed a critical flaw in the Airbus A320's ECU reversal logic when fitted with CFM56 engines. Specifically, it highlighted an issue where the system failed to properly manage asymmetric thrust during a go-around after reverse thrust had been engaged. Airbus is currently working on a modification to address this issue and to rectify the problem with the side-slip beta indicator. Despite this flaw, Airbus also reviewed more than 95 million flights using the A320 with CFM56 engines, finding that this incident, while severe, was an isolated event. Nonetheless, the lessons learned here will lead to further improvements in aircraft systems to ensure that such failures are prevented in the future. As the investigation into the Airbus A320's emergency go-around continued, it was revealed that this specific fault, the failure of the aircraft's engine control system to properly handle the transition from reverse thrust to go-around thrust, had never occurred before. While this incident was an isolated event, the findings that emerged during the investigation were deeply concerning. What the team uncovered during their review of flight data was far more troubling. It turns out that instances where pilots selected reverse thrust and then attempted to go around, against all standard procedures, happened with alarming frequency, about once in every 1 million flights. While that might seem rare, given the massive number of Airbus A320 flights operating worldwide, this translates to approximately one such event every month. And remember, this data was only from Airbus A320 aircraft. Considering that the rule to never attempt a go-around after reverse thrust has been selected is a universally recognized safety standard across the entire airline industry, this could imply that this is a wider issue affecting all fleets. The fact that pilots across various airlines are reacting in similar ways to similar conditions suggests that this could represent a very real risk, one that could be bigger than anyone realized, and possibly a risk greater than any previously identified in similar investigations. For pilots watching this, the takeaway is simple. If you've landed and selected reverse thrust, you're staying on the ground. Rejected landings are no longer an option. This is critical information for every pilot to remember. Additionally, for airline safety managers, it would be highly valuable to incorporate a check into your Operational Flight Data Monitoring (OFDM) system. A simple flag, landing, reverse thrust selected, and go around within 10 seconds, could provide vital data and reveal whether this is an ongoing issue in aviation. It would be interesting to see what patterns emerge from this type of data analysis, as it could be an indication of a broader systemic issue. After the incident, the crew of TAP Flight 174 leveled off at 3,000 feet and completed the necessary checklist for a single engine operation. They briefed the cabin crew and passengers, and after making the appropriate adjustments, they returned for vectors into a successful single-engine landing on runway 22L at Copenhagen. The new runway choice provided a much longer available landing distance of 3,300 meters, a significant improvement over runway 30, which had a much shorter available distance. The extended runway was crucial for this landing. With only one engine functioning, the approach had to be flown with lower flaps and higher speeds, requiring more distance to safely bring the aircraft to a stop. Once they safely touched down, the aircraft taxied to the stand, and all 109 passengers and crew were able to disembark without incident. Both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder were successfully retrieved, and the data was analyzed, along with video footage from airport surveillance cameras and testimonies from the pilot. Together, these elements helped the investigation team piece together the sequence of events and the technical anomalies that contributed to the incident. As a result of this investigation, several safety recommendations were made. On top of the already discussed modifications to the aircraft systems, it was also recommended that certification requirements for new aircraft be updated once again. The new requirement would ensure that the reverse thrust system could be fully canceled, not only after a successful full landing, but also during a worst-case scenario, such as a balanced landing or go-around. This would improve the aircraft's ability to handle unexpected situations where reverse thrust had been engaged and ensure that pilots can regain full control of the aircraft when needed. In essence, this incident pushed aviation one step further toward improving safety, a step that was made without anyone getting hurt. A true success in the industry's ongoing mission to protect lives. As I wrap up this story, I'd like to remind everyone that while this particular event was a harrowing one, the lessons learned from it are crucial for the continued development of aviation safety. The industry will undoubtedly take the necessary steps to mitigate such risks, ensuring that these types of events are not only rare, but completely preventable in the future. Please consider supporting the work my team and I do here. Whether it's through a simple like, comment, or through my Patreon page, every bit of support helps us continue to bring you these important stories. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this analysis both informative and thought-provoking. Check out these videos next, and have an absolutely fantastic day. Goodbye.